Hello, I've just watched an interesting video on BBC World, Have Your Say, um, and it dealt with several stories, but it's the closing one I want to draw your attention to. Apparently, the Shanghai subway has recently put up posters warning women not to dress in what they argue is a sexually provocative way. And there was a bit of a conversation slash debate about this issue. Apparently, someone had taken a picture of a girl that he thought, I think it was a guy sent this picture in, he thought she was being sexually provocative, but the people on the panel speculated that it may have been some sort of flashbulb, because her clothes are very dark and it sort of, this photo from behind showed her underwear and it looked like that only came up because it was some sort of flash. And it was a hot day in Shanghai apparently. Anyway, it was a debate about whether the Shanghai authorities were right to do this or not. And there's a similar issue in big cities all over the world about how women dress and sexual harassment and so on. So what's my stance on the issue as a man? Firstly, I would say I roughly agreed with the panel in about 70 to 80% of what they were saying. I would say, there's never any excuse for a woman to be harassed. No woman asked to be harassed. It's a very unpleasant experience for a woman to go through. It can be a frightening experience, I think. And no woman should have to put up with that. Someone towards the end of the video, a woman from Nairobi, I think made an interesting point that no matter how women dress, some men will harass them. And that's true. There are men who are so sexually insecure, that they will harass women who are even very conservatively dressed. I think basically a woman has a right to dress whatever way she wants. In most circumstances, there's some situations where I would say it is inappropriate. Like, for example, you're not going to wear a bikini at a funeral. That would be tasteless. But in the same way, a man shouldn't sort of be topless or something. There's some circumstances where you should be respectfully dressed. But in most circumstances, I would say people should dress the way they want. However, I think it's important to evaluate what exactly we mean by harassment. Now, to me, sexual harassment, is being very forward with a woman, sort of indicating that you want sexual action with her, that you making your attention towards her very obvious, making crude comments towards her, making her feel uncomfortable. And I do say women because about 90% of the time it is men towards women. There might be some circumstances where you have women saying things to good-looking men, but I think it's fair to say it is the vast majority of the time it is women. That's how I define harassment, and apparently Shanghai does have a big problem with this, which is why the city authorities felt the need to act. The question is, are they blaming the victims? Or is it just helpful advice? That's sort of the underlying question. One of the contributors they were speaking to several people. There was a student from Shanghai, female student, a woman from London, and a professor, again, another woman from the US. Maybe they should have had a man on the panel. Not sure about that. The interviewer was a man, but all three panelists were women, so maybe they should have balanced it out a bit. But the person I agreed most with probably was the student in Shanghai. What she was basically saying is women should be allowed to dress the way they want, but they also have some degree of responsibility. One thing I would say as a straight man, as a heterosexual man, what you cannot do is try and force a man to not have certain thoughts in his mind. Now, I guarantee you, pretty much every heterosexual man in the world, if he sees a good-looking girl, or a girl who is wearing a low-cut top or a short dress or something, look, he is going to think about it, and he's going to look in many circumstances. Frankly, I would. But that is not the same as pouncing on her and wanting to rape her and so on. I believe any self-respecting man can restrain himself and know the limits. Now, I believe if a girl dresses in a way that does show a significant amount of her body, she really cannot blame men for looking, because you're asking men to change their biological thought process. That's just, and it is actually impossible for men to do that. However, it is possible for us to restrain ourselves and not make her feel intimidated, and not sort of gawk at her. Now, when I think about it, if I, for example, this is my own situation, if I'm on a metro and I see a girl a few seats away who's sort of got a low dress, maybe a low cut top, when she gets on, I'll look at her for 2 seconds. Of course I will. And I'll think in my head, yeah, nice. But I'm not going to, I'll no control. I'm not going to like stare at her, I want her. I'm not going to pounce on her. I'm not going to sort of force myself on her. And some men don't know the limits. Some men will do that. And that's wrong. Those men have no excuses. You're not any more man than I am. So you've no excuses. No woman wants to be harassed. But I do think it's important we define exactly what is harassment. There's some parts of the world that have women-only carriages. I believe Sao Paulo and Delhi, their metro systems have women-only carriages. I'm not so sure I agree with this. Now, I respect the fact that both those cities have big problems with reports of sexual harassment, but there's several factors to consider. Number one, will it actually solve the problem? Because even if you have single gender carriages, there could still be sexual assaults and sort of the queues and so on. There's also other factors. In a busy transit system, people are going to inevitably rub against each other. Now, there may well be some circumstances where there's insecure women who maybe have been a victim of sexual assault before. In a busy situation, when people are rubbing against each other, they may feel that's another assault, when in actual fact it is a harmless situation when the man is just like everyone else and he's amongst the crowd, and that's a factor that I think maybe is being ignored in some situations. Now, I'm not saying that all women who report this are liars. I believe many of them are telling the truth, so please don't interpret it that way. But I do believe in a situation like this you have to look at everything. Women-only carriages, I think that's insulting to men. Maybe some men would support it because it means they're not going to be falsely accused. Because if they're on a men-only carriage, but then that's unfair, because a woman could choose to go onto a man's carriage. I do think a lot of men in this situation will fear being falsely accused when they've done nothing. And that's why these idiots, these lowlifes who do harass women, they're bad for everyone. They're bad for women because they make women scared, and their behaviour is unacceptable. But they also make life harder for other men, because then they lead women to believe that we're all like that, and we really, really aren't. Ladies, if you're watching, I guarantee you the majority of men can restrain themselves. And there's another factor, the woman from London who struck me as quite slightly feminist. I actually agreed with what she was saying. There's situations where women will want themselves to be noticed, and I agree with what she's saying. There's a difference between dressing sexily and dressing like a prostitute. So, for instance, a woman, I believe, can be classy and show a bit of flesh, but still be classy and elegant. And then you get women who would wear a very short skirt, heavy makeup, really low cut top. Now, to me, that's dressing like a prostitute. And I still wouldn't condone sexual assault. I would never ever condone sexual assault. But I think it's very naive of women to do that. Because the fact of the matter is, some men will. It doesn't matter how much we try to moralise them. I can say it's wrong, you could say it's wrong. That won't change their behaviour. So, someone argued, maybe the Shanghai authorities are only making pragmatic policies. Maybe all they're doing is responding to this problem. Because they can arrest men who assault. They can, tell men not to do it. Maybe they should do that as well. But maybe it's also fair to say, look, if you dress in a certain way, there is a chance that some men will harass you. I don't know. It's an interesting subject. Like I say, I'm 70 to 80% in agreement with the women on that panel. And as a man, I think it's despicable that any man would sexually harass a woman. You might think it's innocent, but you're frightening her. And no woman wants that. Just because she, in your opinion, is dressing in a sexually provocative way does not mean she wants you to come up to her. Just show some restraint. If I can do it, I'm a 100% red-blooded male. I love women. I love the female form, but I can restrain myself. I don't feel a need to pounce on a woman to make her feel uncomfortable. Be a man. Restrain yourself. Don't be weak. So when we talk about responsibility, men also have responsibility not to do it. A woman's body is her body. You don't have a right to infringe her rights. At the same time, I would say to women, you do have a right to dress the way you want, but if you do dress in a sexually obvious way, you have a right not to be harassed, but don't expect men not to look at you. They will. Men will look at you. I'm not saying they should stare, but you cannot wear a low-cut top and expect men not to look, to even glance, because they will. And that does not mean they necessarily are going to rape you or something. Just what I would say is it just calls for common sense all around. But on a hot day, especially in parts of the world with very warm temperatures, I would say it's absurd to expect women to dress like nuns. That's just ridiculous. If in those circumstances, if a woman is dressing down, so to speak, she's doing it because of the weather, and she has every right to do it because of the weather. So as a man, I would say, girls, if you have been a victim of assault, as a man, my heart goes out to you for what you've been through. No woman should have to go through that. And you have no reason to feel guilty. You've done nothing wrong. Men, have some respect. No woman wants to be harassed. Have some control. Lastly, I would just make the point, we have to be careful in the language we use here, because not every man is a sex maniac. Not every man. Most decent guys can control themselves. So I do wish they would change the rhetoric sometimes in this little debate. They were talking about, we say men should do this, what they should have said was, the men who do this, they should have emphasised that. And I got the impression at several points they were speaking in generic terms, and I didn't like that one little bit. I never like that, speaking in generic terms. Now, okay, they would have meant the men who are talking about, the men who are doing that, but I still think the language is important. The language we use is significant. It's important. So they should have emphasized they were talking about the men who do it, not all men. That's my conclusion, really. I'll put the link to the video. Let me know your thoughts. Do say if you're a man or a woman, because that is significant. So my conclusion, there's no excuse for sexual harassment, but we have to define, simply looking at a woman, I don't consider that sexual harassment. Staring at her, yes, but simply glancing at her, that's crazy to suggest that's harassment. I did see a little short film once called, I forget what it was called. Anyway, it was set in the London Underground. Denise Van Outen played this very sexually alluring woman, and an old man next to her was trying his best not to get aroused, and she was blatantly trying to arouse him. She was actually pushing her breasts provocatively and so on. But I think that's a bit of artistic license. Most women don't act like that. So this short film was a bit of artistic license. And then the man was made to feel guilty because he got a hard-on, basically. But that was artistic license. Most women don't want to be harassed, and most men can restrain themselves. That's my conclusion.